This is Rumour Control, here are the facts.
Alien3 is a strange one in terms of games. It's normally a ritual where big budget, well-loved cult films of the 80s and 90s had extremely bad games of the films. Back to the Future, or The Running Man to name a couple. We then got Alien3, which I remember being overhyped at the time and was everywhere you looked. Sadly for Alien fans, Alien3 was somewhat of a big letdown due to constant script changes, bad CGI use rather than practical effects, a lack of consistency with the first two films, and the killing off of favourite characters such as Hicks and Newt. A very strange storyline compared to the previous two films, and Ripley herself, who just seems very odd in character compared to anything else the audience once loved her for. Yes, this film wasn't good for several reasons and likely is one of the weakest entries next to Alien Resurrection, so how could a game based on such a bad film be actually good? And how could LJN, notoriously known for awful games, make this possible for many of its versions? Today we are taking a look at every Alien3 game released for home consoles, portables and microcomputers. I will not be talking about the awesome arcade rail shooter known as Alien3 The Gun, as this was only an arcade release and was never actually ported to home computers or consoles. I'm going to rank these from worst to best, but as always, if you watch my arcade port series, this is by no means anything official, and all I ask is that you be respectful to my choices. The original Game Boy 1993 release by LJN is very different from any other Alien3 game in this video. By looking at the gameplay, you'll easily see why that is. It's a top-down adventure game with puzzle elements included. This was my first time ever playing this version, and to be fair, although different to the platforming formula that was the common theme for the Alien3 games, this actually seemed okay, but for newcomers to this version on the Game Boy would definitely mean investing sometimes get to know the game. We frequently get pop-ups from characters from the film who provide some information such as Andrews, and then it is up to the player who plays Ripley to follow the instructions or whatever it might be in order to progress further into the game. For example, when aliens appear in the game, we must get to the armory to grab weaponry to defend ourselves. The graphics for a Game Boy game here are very good, and the cutscenes and introduction to the game are really nicely done too. It's definitely a game worth playing if you're into adventure games. Some will argue that the Nintendo Entertainment System LJN 1993 release isn't great compared with other versions. Personally, I would say it's a mediocre game. For those who hated the difficulty level of most of the Alien3 games will actually find this version very refreshing. Many versions will not give you enough time to see aliens approaching you and suddenly you're on the floor injured. The NES game provides a more zoomed out look where we can see more of the map, which gives us slightly more time to shoot down aliens as they speed towards us. Some have argued that this is just way too easy, as from the get-go we're equipped with the pulse rifle, grenade launcher, flamethrower and hand grenades. And yes, I can see why some would say it was too easy, and it's also taken away some suspense as well. But it does make the game a little bit more manageable having started the game with all these weapons. Is it a groundbreaking NES game? Well, not really. There are better NES games around in this style without an annoying timer that runs out far too quickly. The music and opening to the game here is actually pretty cool. Like I say, the easier version out of the bunch, not necessarily an awful game, it even controls fairly nicely too. The Sega Game Gear also had a version of Alien3. It is pretty much the same game as the upcoming Sega Master System's version, although this just seems far too laggy for its own good in comparison. It was like the Game Gear was saying no to this game. It is playable, but slowdowns happen far more than not, and it has slightly zoomed in gameplay screen, which makes this one a little tougher than the Sega Master System's version. The Sega Master System's 1992 release is actually a pretty good one. Its layout and gameplay is likely the version many of you are familiar with, as it's pretty much a cut down version of the Sega Mega Drive's version. It's leap years ahead of the NES game for sure, and looks pretty good for a Sega Master System game. In fact, I'd likely say it looks better than the average Sega Master System game, visually speaking. The music is also great here, which is an 8-bit version of the Mega Drive's game. Its use of colours are pretty good here, with some very fast sprites being used. I particularly like how aliens explode here. Okay, so it's not green acid exploding, but this brings its own charm. It's nice to control in possibly one of the easier versions of the game, where constantly looking at the timer and worrying how many hostages remain doesn't seem to cause much of a sweat when playing it. It also has some nice introduction animations to the game, and overall a really nice presentation that the developers look like they put some extra work in to make this Master System game a really good one. The Commodore 64 had a version of Alien3 and was the only 8-bit microcomputer to receive one, unless you held on for many years to have the Aliens Neoplasma for the ZX Spectrum and ZX Spectrum Next. Virgin Games released this one back in 1993 for Europe, and really it was a late release for Commodore 64, at which point most kids had moved on to higher spec computers or consoles such as the Commodore Amiga or the Super NES. Is Alien3 any good for the Commodore 64? Well, yes it is. It's a really solid game with music and sound effects combined into the gameplay. Ripley controls really well here too. In fact, the entire game scrolls nicely and it's really well done here. Little touches that makes it look nice when shooting is the flashes of the pulse rifle, which illuminate on Ripley to give it that more realistic look. The game is of course highly challenging where the timer is concerned, but that goes without saying with most Alien3 games. The timer is the most challenging part of this game because it is so harsh with giving you very little time to find prisoners. In terms of colours used, like I say, it is a later Commodore 64 release, and at which point most coders had likely to become more knowledgeable with what works and what doesn't work when programming games for the C64. I have largely always looked at many later C64 games to look much better than its older titles. Commodore Amiga fans would have rejoiced with this 1992 Virgin Interactive release. Easily one of the best film to game conversions on the platform. I seriously though have one quarrel with this version, and that is literally just being able to have music or sound effects within the game itself. Aside from that, like I say, a really solid game for this 16-bit home computer. The Atari ST didn't have to compete with this one either, as it didn't have Alien3 at all. So visually, this version looks much like the Sega Mega Drive version, although it does have a couple of cutbacks which the Amiga couldn't handle so well, such as the audio situation. As a game itself, it's responsive enough and a tough one for sure. It scrolls really nicely and it's generally a great version of Alien3. The Super Nintendo's version has much more of a cinematic approach compared to everything else here. A superb and fairly lengthy introduction here, which gives you a full explanation and storyline of Ripley's crash landing on the prison planet. The sprites used and backgrounds look realistic, kind of the same realism that something like Batman Forever went for, although not quite digitized like Batman Forever. The sound in particular with the Super Nintendo game is probably the best of all the Alien3 games in this video. Destroying aliens give them a painful sound, much like it was actually ripped from the Alien film itself. Although the layout is different here from the more talked about Sega Mega Drive version, I don't think it is actually a bad thing. This game just seems very faithful to what it is translating from the film itself. This is a really awesome port for the Super Nintendo and highly recommended. This is the version I would play most of back in the day, and I still do on and off if I'm honest. A neighbour of mine in the early 1990s that my brother and I would randomly name as Trouble used to play this version on her Mega Drive too, so it's much like the Commodore Amiga game, although much more refined and features music as well as sound effects. It's definitely the best version of Alien3, and damn, it's a tough one with that timer ticking away ready to kill you off. As I have mentioned a few times in this video, this is the version that most referred to with the Alien3 game because it's very likely the best of the all versions, which is why I put this one in first place here. The colours used are nice and bright, but not too overly colourful where it makes the game look cartoon-like. Controls on this are extremely tight, and the sense of panic with this version is very real. Once you run low on ammo and you still have prisoners to rescue with swarms of aliens hanging around, this version truly gives you that dreaded fear where at any moment you will die. And that's it for my ranking the Alien3 games today, so let us know in the comments section which version you preferred. Would you like me and much prefer the Sega Mega Drive version, or was you a little bit more sympathetic to the end of the days of the Commodore 64? Anyways, until next video comes along, thanks for watching.
The suspense.
It's here!
3 times the danger.
Run as fast as you can!
3 times the terror. Sigourney Weaver.